Andersonville Cemetery, Georgia, 100 or so miles south of Atlanta. Here, every Memorial Day, the prisoners of war from every conflict in which the United States has participated are jointly remembered. It is an occasion, too, for veterans to get together and reminisce, and for former prisoners to recall their repatriation and be thankful. Not every prisoner survived his captivity. Countless suffered at the hands of their captors. The American Civil War was one where prisoners did suffer unduly, where it was as dangerous to be captured as to remain in combat. Yet it was brother causing suffering to brother, for both were Americans. Just as they marched into battle shoulder to shoulder, so were they buried. 56,000 died in the prisons of North and South. Now, so many decades after the event, the hurt is still there, and people still ask, why?
More than 45,000 Union soldiers were confined here, and of these, more than 25% died from the harshness of war, disease, malnutrition, overcrowding, or exposure. The Andersonville National Cemetery was established in July of 1865, where more than 12,000 from the nearby prison were buried.
The prisoners who died here were the victims of overcrowding and shortage of medicine resulting from the Union's blockade of the South. Ironically, it was Northern generals who were partly responsible for the ending of prisoner exchanges that led to that overcrowding. Even so, Andersonville is a blot on the face of Southern honor. Many cite it as what happens when notions of total war get out of hand. As the casualties escalated and both sides got frustrated, the South realized that after Gettysburg, a military victory was a forlorn dream and foreign intervention now unlikely. Their best hope of winning independence was to wear the North down so that antagonism to continuing the war could lead to Lincoln's defeat in the presidential election in November 1864. The Union leadership, for its part, could only counter by making the struggle so unpleasant for Southerners, both soldiers and civilians alike, that their will to resist would weaken first.
The war was a bitter, destructive war because it became a war of society against society. Of course, it's always said the Civil War is the first modern war in many ways. It did not begin as such. It began as a conventional war of army against army, in which the distinction between civilian target and military targets were very carefully maintained or respected. But with the abolition of slavery, with the emancipation of the slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, this announced not only that slavery was going to die, but that The whole fabric of Southern society was henceforth going to be a military target. That to win this war, the North would have to really destroy the fundamental institution of Southern society. And this meant that there could not be any compromise, that the war would go on to unconditional surrender of one side or another, and that it would involve vast disruption among civilians as well as within the military.
The bitterness can be explained because it was a brothers' war in very fact, and because both sides misunderstood, well, shall I say, neither side could easily forgive the other. The South thought slavery was a noble institution, the North thought it was a wicked institution, and they carried these things with us. Instead of singing John Brown's Body, they sang, "We'll hand Jeff Davis on the sour apple tree while we go marching on." On the other hand, there was another side to it, and that was the side of the officers, the side of the gentlemen, the side of Lee and of Lincoln. Lee never used the word enemy in referring to the North. Lincoln didn't use the word enemy in referring to the South. And there was a camaraderie of the West Pointers and others. When General Pickett's baby was born, the Union side lighted up bonfires on the other side and sent over a silver service. Imagine that in World War II. Imagine that in Vietnam. Therefore, it was to some extent an aristocratic war.
Because of the advent of the camera, we have a better idea of what the Civil War warrior looked like than we have of any of his predecessors. Photography was barely 20 years old when the first shots were fired at Sumter. Fortunately for us, many thousands of images from those days have survived. However dashing their poses, their demeanor was certainly serious. Of the third year of the war, no one was in any doubt that it was a grim, purposeful, increasingly dirty business.
If you look at the second inaugural address of Lincoln, where he says, "If every drop of blood drawn by the slash must be repaid by one drawn by the sword, so as it was said 2,000 years ago in the Bible, so be it." God is on our side, and that's the conviction of both sides. And if you, for example, listen to the music, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the terrible swiftness of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on." That kind of attitude means, therefore, that you are fighting not simply a war, you're fighting a holy crusade. The South, as the war began to escalate and the consequences of the war began to become clearly evident, everyone in the South understood that the whole of what was the South was now on the wheel of fortune, and no one could be sure what the consequences were going to be.
Southern mothers were now left to grieve, not just at a son departing, but more likely at a son having been killed. The Confederacy was dipping deep into its manpower reserves. Likewise, the North, where financial inducement failed to fill the gaps in the ranks with volunteers. Violent protests followed the resort to a draft, a year after the Confederacy had done so, nowhere more so than in New York City.
Only a week and a half or so earlier, out of Gettysburg had come reports of something like 53,000 casualties in 3 days of fighting. So that in a sense, what you almost assume is you're a drafter, you're likely to be killed. And perhaps even more to the point was when they start actually calling out the first names. The first names were Riley and O'Shaughnessy and O'Dwyer, McManus and McGuire, and the immediate reaction was, on the part of the Irish, that they're finally giving it to us, but good, and we're going to give it back. Around this particular churchyard, out in the street, thronged mobs of people who would storm out of this area, northward into vulnerable areas of the city. And which perhaps was the most lasting impact was the fact that much of the violence circled around Gramercy Park, around the wealthy mansions of Lexington Avenue, and suddenly the wealthy were being driven from their homes, oftentimes barely able to get out alive. And out of this came this sort of awesome thought that perhaps America was not immune from class conflict.
Estimates of the numbers killed in the New York draft riots vary from 120 to 1,200, though some of the wilder rumors at the time put the figure at several thousand. They were certainly the worst street violence in American history. Units that had recently fought at Gettysburg had to be recalled to quell it. What began as a protest against the first draft under the new law quickly turned into an ugly race riot, in which not only was a Negro orphanage burnt to the ground, but at least a dozen blacks were senselessly lynched. Resentment towards Negroes in many immigrant communities had been inflamed by recent strikes broken by employers bringing in blacks. The riots showed that racial prejudice was never far below the surface in the North. Lincoln was determined, though, to persist with emancipation.
Essentially what emancipation is a very carefully measured political device on Lincoln's part to weaken the South and strengthen the North. By that I mean that he proclaimed that all of the slaves in areas behind Confederate lines were free as of the 1st of January 1863. It's a clever proclamation in the sense that Lincoln proclaimed freedom in the areas that he had no control over. And he specifically exempted those areas, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Louisiana, that had already been recaptured. He specifically exempted them from the proclamation, specifically exempted the border slave states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and essentially said that those blacks behind Confederate lines, if they could manage to get free, that is, to escape through the lines, would be free. It prompted a rather massive exodus of blacks towards the northern side. The South, in turn, had to take a variety of kinds of precautions. And the result of this sort of balancing act is that the North gets measurably stronger, the South becomes measurably weaker. And I would say that after January 63, one sees a decisive weakening in the Southern effort and a progressive strengthening in the Northern effort.